This is the second mini lecture for Module 1 in Discover Geography. Again, these are general videos that serve Discover Geography both in the summer asynchronous form and in the fall and spring synchronous form. So again, those of you taking the class, understand that you need to also do the readings for the class. These are not a substitute for doing the readings. But at the end of the last mini lecture, I talked about geography as both a spatial science and what we would call a methodological science. So from the standpoint of being spatial, what we're saying again is why and what. Okay, in other words, we're talking about where things are, how they relate to each other in space, how they move through time in space, and then how their distributions change over time. So let's take a look. As an example, we might say we are interested in, and this happens to be a previous class, and I said, well, okay, where are individuals and where are they by major? So if we looked just in general, we would say that, well, okay, in general, people in the class were represented by the western part primarily of Pennsylvania, but we had a few that were scattered a little bit farther east and a little bit farther west. Now I can tell you over time, this class has changed in terms of distribution, and in fact, Slippery Rock's population has changed over time. It has become somewhat more concentrated in the western part of the state. We might also look, though, you'll notice on here, if we look at the location of certain majors, one we could argue, although there's not many of them, we have right up here, we have our secondary ed majors. Our health and physical ed majors are way out here. And so we might ask the question, well, are those distributions unique, or is that just kind of an artifact? But we look at where they are now, how these majors have changed through time, how Slippery Rock students have changed through time. We might also ask if these are the permanent locations of Slippery Rock students within this class, where do they move next? In other words, when they graduate, how far away do they move? What is the movement of these phenomena, if you will? If you look at current housing status, the other thing we can look at here is the distribution. For example, these are commuters versus those that reside off campus relative to their permanent address. And so one of the things that, to be perfectly honest, somewhat surprised me is that we have a lot of commuters and people that reside on campus that exist in the same area, but as we go farther out, it's fairly clear that the non-commuter population is certainly distributed much more widely than the commuter population. And it's not terribly surprising, but it gives us an example of how geographers might look at the phenomena of students. We can also look at this in terms of this change in time. And again, of course, what's been happening in the last year has changed things rather dramatically. And what we say now, again, if we look at housing status, I commuted to campus from my permanent residence in 2019. I did not attend, or I lived in university housing. Well, what's interesting is that if we look at these and we say, well, these are the people that commuted versus those that didn't, this distribution changed over time. And again, that's an important idea. Did the commuting population change over time? Did it expand or contract due to the pandemic? All right, so that's one way of thinking about geography as a spatial science, understanding wheres of things and the whys of those wheres. The other thing, though, is that geography, we often refer to it as a methodological discipline. And what that means is that geography can look at just about anything through this lens of where. So the method is understanding where things are. So again, as an example, I can ask the question, where are prairies? The important idea there, though, is not just where are they. That's just kind of like putting pins on a map. But the question becomes all of the tools that we use to understand the dynamics of that where. Why are prairies where they are? How do they contract or expand over time, especially with things like climate change occurring? We might, though, also ask, for example, where certain businesses concentrate, and then how do those businesses expand through space, or do they not? So the lens of where And again, for your notes, the lens of where, if you will, geography is a method of analysis, asks first where something is at present, the where of something. We then ask movement. In other words, how do those things move over what period of time? We also ask what makes a where unique. The idea of place is that what makes slippery rock, if you will, and what makes it different in a sense in terms of how we understand and experience it than, for example, Newcastle, or how similar is it? We can then take that idea of placedness, the uniqueness, and we begin to say, well, where are the regions that coalesce? What are the geographic extents that have something in common? And that's what we mean by region. And then we can talk about interaction across space. How do different spatial phenomena interact to produce the world that we live in? For example, how does transportation infrastructure influence the culture of the automobile? Or how does transportation networks, infrastructure, influence things like business success or failure? These are the interactions of different phenomena in space producing the landscape that we experience. That is geography as a methodological discipline. Now, the other way that we often talk about geography, and to some degree the modules in this class are going to deal with this, geography deals with both human and non-human components of the environment. From the human side, we deal with the ideas of culture. In other words, how and why do different areas, different groups of people, why are they different? How do they differ? What is in common? How does ideas of culture, that is the things that we experience and believe and do and create, how do those differ across space? We can also look at humans in terms of the historical geography. In other words, the movement of people through time and how cultures and other aspects of human existence have changed across space and time. And that ties a bit into the economic geography, but economic geography is really about how we understand the space of economics, transportation, logistics, marketing. All of these things are economic geographies. And of course, geographers are fundamentally interested in populations, where and how many human beings there are. The census, for example, is very important to simply understanding human distributions. And that's demography. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't understand political geographies. In fact, it's going to be very important in the coming years to understand redistricting. In other words, the distribution of people, their characteristics, influences how political geographies exist. So again, human geography studies. We can see this in a couple of different ways. Again, I'm going to look at this just from my example of the research I do on spirits. And so this is the distribution of distilleries in the United States. And one of the things that is not at all surprising is that there are very, very large concentrations in some areas. And then as we move west, you'll notice that there are virtually none. And if you look in, for example, Utah and Nevada, what you will see is that there are cultural reasons for this distribution. So we are going to link economics, distilleries, with culture. We might also look at some aspects of human demography. For example, the map of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual deficit diagnoses. Again, geographers' epidemiology is one specialized area of demography. And one of the things that's very interesting is that we see there are certain concentrations of both autism spectrum disorder, which is, again, is significantly different than other or forms of intellectual deficit. But we might ask the question, well, why? Why do we see such a high concentration in these areas? Or I'm sorry, I'm reading the map upside down, forgive me for that, extremely low here and here. And then we see, again, this is the higher rates, we begin to see these clusters in northern Nebraska here. And then in, for example, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, slightly higher, and then extremely high here through Idaho. Well, why? Why are those distributions the way they are? Well, one of the interesting things about this is that if we relate at least the top to this, autism resources, in other words, resources for individuals with autism spectrum disorder, are concentrated in certain areas. And it may be, one argument has often been made, that the prevalence of resources may produce higher rates of diagnosis, not necessarily in terms of its absolute presence in a population, but the actual diagnosis. So again, we begin to look at those types of things. We might also look at life expectancies. Why is it so low here and so much higher in certain areas? Geographers ask that question, why this pattern is the way it is. Okay? And again, we might ask questions about GDP, gross domestic product. And we will look at this, the economy of the United States, and how much certain states and certain populations add to it, if you will. Again, politics. If you look at this map, the red, if you will, all Democrat, now these are 2000, 2008, 2016 county results. In other words, if you see a county here, for example, right here that is all Republican, in each of these election cycles, these counties voted exclusively this way. The same is true, obviously, the blue counties. And then you'll notice certain trends. This is what political geographers look at. All right, now, physical geography. Physical geography examines the landscape that humans exist in, but in a sense, how that landscape exists in its, if you will, natural form. Areas of geomorphology, landscape analysis, pedology, soils and soil fertility and soil processes, climatology, again, climate across landscapes, the living environment biogeography, and then oceanography, characteristics and distributions of phenomena in the oceans. This class will focus predominantly on the human side of this. We will, of course, touch on all these, but primarily as it relates to the human factors. We do have a course at Slippery Rock, the natural environment, which deals primarily with these components. All right, now that's it for mini lecture 2. We will pick this up in mini lecture 3 and wrap up module 1, where we begin to discuss aspects of the toolbox for geographers. We'll see you then.